The big signs you should move on from avoidant doesn't usually announce itself like a dramatic breakup moment. It shows up quietly, almost disrespectfully subtle at first, like your peace slowly being replaced with confusion you keep trying to rationalize. At the beginning, you don't even realize you're stuck in something unhealthy because avoidant dynamics don't start with chaos, they start with potential. There are good moments, even beautiful ones, and those moments become the emotional trap. You remember the warmth, the rare affection, the short bursts of closeness, and you keep telling yourself that this is just a phase, that with time, consistency will come. But instead of stability, you get inconsistency. Instead of clarity, you get mixed signals. Instead of emotional safety, you get waiting. And slowly, without noticing it, your nervous system starts adapting to unpredictability as if it's normal love. That's where this becomes dangerous, not because avoidants are villains, but because the emotional rhythm of the connection starts reshaping your standards for what love is supposed to feel like. And if you've ever found yourself overthinking texts, rereading conversations, or trying to decode silence like it holds hidden meaning, then you're already inside the cycle this video is about. So stay with this, because sometimes the biggest sign you should move on isn't something they do loudly, it's the quiet emotional exhaustion you start carrying every single day. And if you find yourself nodding along, consider subscribing, not because of pressure, but because understanding these patterns can genuinely save you from repeating emotional cycles that slowly drain your sense of peace. One of the first big signs you should move on from an avoidant is when you realize you're always waiting for a version of them that only shows up occasionally, almost like a temporary emotional update that never becomes permanent. At first, they might give you moments that feel real, where they're present, attentive, even emotionally warm in ways that make you think, this is it, this is who they really are. But then, almost unpredictably, they shift back into distance, silence, or emotional unavailability. And instead of recognizing that inconsistency as a pattern, you start treating it like a phase. You begin living for the good version of them, the one who texts first, the one who opens up slightly, the one who makes you feel chosen. But the painful truth is that this version is not a baseline, it's an exception, and your emotional system starts reorganizing itself around waiting. Waiting for them to come back emotionally, waiting for them to feel safe again, waiting for them to act like the person you already saw but can't consistently access. And over time, this waiting becomes your relationship, not the connection itself, but the anticipation of it. That's when you know something is deeply off, because healthy love doesn't require emotional patience as a survival skill. It doesn't make you feel like you're constantly on standby for connection. When you find yourself emotionally adjusting your life around their unpredictability, that's not love evolving, that's your nervous system adapting to instability. Another major sign you should move on is when they only show up when it's convenient for them emotionally or practically, but rarely when you actually need consistency. This is where the imbalance becomes undeniable, even if you've been trying to ignore it. With avoidant dynamics, connection often happens on their terms. They reach out when they feel emotionally available, not when the relationship actually needs nurturing. They engage when it feels light, safe, or comfortable for them, but when emotional depth is required, they retreat. And slowly you start noticing a pattern where your emotional needs are always secondary to their emotional capacity in that moment. You might need reassurance, clarity, or presence, but if they're overwhelmed, distracted, or emotionally shut down, you simply don't receive it. And instead of questioning the imbalance, you start adjusting your needs downward. You start telling yourself they're just like that, or they need space, or they'll come around later. But what's actually happening is more subtle and more damaging. You're learning to accept emotional inconsistency as normal love, and the more you accept it, the more disconnected you become from your own needs. Because love in this form stops feeling mutual and starts feeling conditional, like access to them depends entirely on their internal state, not the health of the relationship itself. And when you start feeling like you have to wait for emotional permission just to be seen, that's not intimacy anymore. That's emotional unpredictability becoming your baseline. And one of the most overlooked signs you should move on is when you realize you feel emotionally alone even when they are physically present. This is where the disconnect becomes deeply internal, because on paper the relationship still exists, there are conversations, there are interactions, there is contact, but emotionally something is missing that you can't quite explain at first. It feels like talking to someone who is partially there, like you are sharing your inner world, but only receiving fragments in return. You might express something important to you and get minimal response, or a shift in subject, or emotional withdrawal disguised as not knowing what to say. And over time, this creates a strange emotional loneliness where you stop expecting depth altogether. You stop sharing fully. You start holding parts of yourself back because it feels safer than reaching into an emotional space that rarely meets you halfway. And this is where emotional self-abandonment quietly begins, not because you want to disconnect from yourself, but because you're trying to stay connected to someone who can't consistently meet you where you are emotionally. The hardest part is that you may still feel attached, still care deeply, still hope things will change, but the emotional experience itself becomes hollow. And when a relationship starts making you feel alone while still being together, that's one of the clearest emotional signals that something fundamental is missing, not in you, but in the connection itself. Another early but powerful sign you should move on is when conversations stop feeling emotionally open and instead become surface level, avoided, or carefully controlled. At first, you might not notice it because avoidance can still engage in humor, daily updates, casual talk, even moments of connection that feel normal enough to keep you invested. But when you try to go deeper, when you try to understand emotions, fears, intentions, or the relationship itself, something shifts. The conversation gets redirected, minimized, or emotionally softened until the depth disappears. And slowly you begin learning that certain topics are unsafe to bring up, not because they are actually wrong, but because they trigger withdrawal. So you adapt, you stop asking the deeper questions, you stop bringing up emotional needs as clearly as before. You start editing yourself in real time just to keep the connection from shutting down. And without realizing it, your emotional honesty becomes filtered through their capacity to handle it. That is not communication anymore, that is emotional restriction. Because real connection allows depth even when it's uncomfortable. It doesn't require you to shrink your truth just to keep someone emotionally available. And when you find yourself consistently avoiding honesty just to preserve connection, that's often the point where moving on isn't just an emotional decision, it becomes a form of self-respect. And once you start adapting your truth just to keep someone emotionally available, another subtle but powerful sign begins to surface. You find yourself constantly over-explaining your needs like they are somehow too much to ask for. At first, it starts innocently. You try to communicate clearly, you try to be patient, you try to give space for understanding. But over time, something shifts in the dynamic where even basic emotional needs start feeling like negotiations. You begin justifying why you need consistency, why communication matters, why emotional presence is important in a relationship, and instead of those needs being met with understanding, they are often met with distance, discomfort, or silence that forces you to soften your request just to keep the connection intact. So you start editing yourself mid-conversation. You lower your expectations before they even respond. You explain less, not because you have nothing to say, but because saying it fully feels like it might push them away. And this is where something dangerous begins to form emotionally. You start believing that your needs are the problem instead of recognizing that the relationship simply cannot hold them consistently. You start treating emotional neglect as something you need to communicate better, instead of something that should naturally not require constant explanation. And the more you over-explain, the more you unintentionally train yourself to shrink your emotional voice. Until one day you realize you're not asking for more anymore, you're just asking for less distance, less silence, less emotional confusion, and even that feels like too much. And this emotional shrinking often happens alongside another sign you should move on. Their silence slowly starts functioning like emotional control over your internal state. Not because they are intentionally controlling you, but because unpredictability creates emotional dependency without clarity. When someone is inconsistent, your nervous system begins adapting to their silence as a signal. You start analyzing it, interpreting it, reacting to it. A delayed response suddenly changes your mood. A quiet day suddenly feels heavy. A lack of communication starts influencing how you think about yourself, even when nothing external has actually changed. And this is where the emotional imbalance becomes deeper than just communication issues. Because now their absence is no longer neutral, it becomes emotionally active inside you. You find yourself waiting for reassurance that may or may not come. You feel relief when they finally respond and anxiety when they don't. And slowly your emotional stability becomes tied to their availability instead of your own internal grounding. That is not a balanced relationship anymore. That is emotional conditioning shaped by inconsistency. And what makes it even more complicated is that avoidant behavior often feels calm on their side while creating emotional turbulence on yours. They may not even realize how deeply their silence affects you because from their perspective, space feels normal, while for you, space feels like uncertainty. And when a connection repeatedly destabilizes your emotional state without resolution, it stops being just a relationship issue and starts becoming an emotional environment you are living inside every day. That emotional environment often leads to another major sign you should move on. You start shrinking yourself just to keep them comfortable and avoid triggering their withdrawal. This doesn't happen all at once. It develops slowly, almost invisibly. At first, you might adjust small things, how you express emotions, how quickly you respond, how deeply you share. Then gradually you begin filtering your reactions. You stop expressing frustration fully. You soften your excitement so it doesn't feel overwhelming. You hold back emotional honesty so it doesn't create distance, and without realizing it, your entire emotional expression starts revolving around one question: will this push them away? Instead of, is this how I actually feel? And that shift is extremely important because it marks the moment where connection stops being mutual and starts becoming managed. You begin performing emotional safety instead of actually feeling emotionally safe. You become hyper-aware of their reactions, their moods, their withdrawal patterns, and you adjust yourself accordingly just to maintain access to them. But the cost is subtle and heavy at the same time. You slowly lose access to your full emotional self inside the relationship. You become smaller in your expression, quieter in your needs, and more careful with your truth. And over time, this shrinking doesn't just affect the relationship, it affects your identity inside it. Because love should not require you to reduce yourself to remain acceptable. It should expand you, not make you constantly monitor your emotional existence. And while all of this is happening internally, mixed signals become the new normal without you even noticing how distorted things have become. One day there is warmth, connection, closeness that feels like reassurance. The next day there is distance, silence, emotional withdrawal that feels like confusion. And instead of stepping back and recognizing the pattern as instability, you start analyzing each shift individually, trying to find meaning in every emotional fluctuation. You begin building hope around the good moments and excusing the inconsistent ones as stress, fear, timing, or misunderstanding. But what actually happens is that your emotional baseline starts adjusting to inconsistency itself. Stability no longer feels like the expectation, it feels like a rare reward. And unpredictability becomes something you try to interpret instead of something you question. This is one of the most powerful traps in avoidant dynamics because it keeps you emotionally engaged without providing emotional security. You stay invested not because you feel safe, but because you are constantly trying to understand what is real and what is temporary. And the deeper you go into that cycle, the more emotionally invested you become in potential rather than reality. You are no longer responding to what the relationship is consistently giving you, you are responding to what it sometimes gives you. And that is exactly what keeps so many people stuck, because mixed signals do not just create confusion, they create attachment through inconsistency itself. And eventually, all of this leads to something even more emotionally draining. You stop feeling peace in the relationship and start feeling a constant background level of anxiety instead. It becomes subtle at first, almost easy to ignore. You still have moments of happiness, moments of connection, moments where things feel okay, but underneath all of it, there is a constant emotional tension you can't fully relax out of. You are always slightly alert, slightly uncertain, slightly bracing for the next shift in energy, and that lack of emotional safety slowly replaces what love is supposed to feel like. Instead of feeling grounded, you feel emotionally stretched. Instead of feeling secure, you feel like you are managing uncertainty. Instead of feeling calm, you feel like you are constantly interpreting the relationship rather than living it. And this is often the point where your body already knows what your mind is still trying to justify. Because peace is not supposed to be rare in love. Stability is not supposed to feel like a reward. And emotional safety is not supposed to depend on someone's fluctuating capacity to show up. When anxiety becomes more familiar than calm, when confusion becomes more normal than clarity, and when emotional exhaustion becomes part of the routine, that is not a relationship asking you to try harder. That is a relationship quietly showing you it may be time to let go. And once that constant emotional anxiety becomes your baseline, something even more frustrating begins to surface. You realize that during conflict, nothing ever actually gets resolved in a way that restores emotional safety. Instead, difficult conversations with an avoidant often feel like emotional detours rather than real resolutions. You bring up something that hurt you, something that needs clarity, something that requires emotional responsibility, and instead of meeting that moment directly, the conversation either shifts direction, slows down into silence, or gets emotionally diluted until the original issue feels almost unrecognizable. And over time, you start learning the pattern without even being told. You begin approaching conflict more carefully, more cautiously, choosing your words in a way that minimizes the chance of withdrawal, because deep down you already know that full emotional honesty might not lead to resolution, it might lead to distance. So instead of expressing yourself freely, you start managing emotional reactions, both theirs and your own. But what makes this even more painful is that nothing truly gets repaired. The tension might temporarily calm down, but the emotional thread that caused the rupture is never fully addressed. And when conflict doesn't lead to repair, it leads to emotional accumulation. Small, unresolved moments begin stacking on top of each other until the relationship feels heavier than it should. Not because of one big event, but because of many unhealed micro-disconnections that never fully found closure. And eventually, you start realizing that you are not in a cycle of resolution and growth, but in a cycle of emotional postponement where nothing is fully faced, only temporarily softened. And in that same cycle, you slowly begin noticing something even more emotionally draining. You are the one constantly repairing the connection. Not equally, not collaboratively, but repeatedly stepping into the emotional gap whenever things break down. You initiate the conversations after silence. You try to rebuild understanding after distance. You explain yourself again after being misunderstood. You reach out after withdrawal. And over time, this creates an emotional imbalance that becomes almost invisible because it develops gradually. At first, you may not even notice it because you care, because you want things to work, because you believe emotional effort is part of love. But slowly it becomes clear that emotional repair is not shared equally. You are the one bridging the distance every time the connection breaks, while the other person often returns only when the emotional pressure has decreased. And this creates a deeply exhausting pattern where your emotional labor becomes the glue holding the relationship together. You start anticipating disconnection instead of connection. You start preparing for emotional repair instead of emotional bonding. And the most draining part is that even when things feel temporarily stable, you know that the stability is fragile, dependent more on your effort than mutual consistency. And when one person is constantly responsible for repairing what breaks, while the other avoids the discomfort of repair, the emotional weight eventually becomes unsustainable, no matter how strong the attachment is. And one of the clearest signs you should move on becomes impossible to ignore when you notice a pattern of emotion